Okay, so now we have our project set up. But one of the things that you always want to do before you start rigging is you want to look at the model and make sure that it has all the proper geometry and everything that you're going to need. What's nice about this piece is it's only one object. It's one solid object. This is technically, the eyeballs are technically not part of the mesh, but they've been combined together, so it's just one single mesh, so you don't really have to worry about that. And we'll get to that in a little bit. So you have this Spider-Man object, and there's not any geometry to group or anything like that, but normally what we'd have is you would have the main mesh, and then you might have different attachments like watches or belts, or maybe hair is separated from the body, eyeballs will be separate from the mesh, and things like that. So what you would do is you would select each of these, every object, every geometry object that's in the scene, which in this case is only one, and then you hit Control G, and then we want to double click it to rename it. So we're just grouping it, and we're going to call this our geo underscore group. So it's good to organize like this. Later on, if we decide to add other attachments to the mesh, then we'll put it in the geo group. Okay, so we have that set up. And now, just so you can see the mesh clearly, which you can when you click it, but just select it for now, and go into wireframe on shaded for a second, and then we can click away. And it might be a little difficult to see the mesh because of the blue on the blue. So you can basically go in here and, let's see, you can turn off texture by hitting 5 instead of 6, and you can kind of see the mesh like this. All right, and all we want to do is we want to take a close look at all of the main places where the character is going to bend, things like joints. So we want to make sure that there's enough geometry right here on the knee. So you want to have extra loops near the knee. You see how the loops are kind of spread out here, and as you get closer to the knee, they start to get closer together. That's not just for shape, it's also for deformation, so that when we bend this knee, it has extra geometry here to stretch and bend. Same thing around the ankles. Ankles look like they're pretty good. You also, one thing a lot of people don't think about is the ball of the foot. You want to make sure there's enough geometry here. This is a pretty solid, evenly distributed geometry, so it's not bad. We don't really need the extra geometry there. Then we need to go up towards the shoulder. And there's enough, you know, going through the torso and everything and around the hips. So we want to look at the shoulders. Just make sure they don't have any weird geometry around the shoulders, which we don't. Around the elbows. Elbow looks pretty good. There's really nothing wrong here. Sometimes you'll see like a triangular junction right here, just because it gives you that sort of realistic looking elbow indentation that you actually have. So on the inside of the elbow, and then on the outside of the elbow, you get this box junction like they have here. You see how it kind of comes down and then sort of rounds off and goes back up. That's called a box junction, and you're used to seeing that. The wrist just needs to have the like 3 loops right around this area, which it does. And then more importantly, or most importantly, is the geometry around the fingers. So you want to have this kind of square junction type stuff right here, these box junctions kind of built into the joints so that they bend and stretch properly. The tips of the fingers don't really matter because they don't bend themselves, just the joints. So we have some here, we have some along these joints, and you notice that there's no box junction here, but they do have extra geometry right about where these joints would be, and that should be more than sufficient. So it looks like we're good. I'm pretty sure it's been mirrored. Let's just double check this real fast, that the geometry on this side looks the same. And I think we're all good. So you always want to do that once over, because if your job in the pipeline is to do the rigging, then you want to make sure the geometry is right. You don't want to necessarily add geometry yourself unless you're the one who actually modeled the character. So you may want to go and talk to the modeler and say, hey, I need a little bit more geometry around the elbows or the wrist if there isn't enough. In this case, we have a perfectly clean model, something that we can really work with to create a nice clean rig.